In November 2018, one of the most powerful executives in the automotive world was pulled off a private jet at Haneda Airport and arrested. Carlos Ghosn had saved Nissan from $20 billion in debt. He turned a dying company into a global force. The executives who watched him do it spent years building the case that would end him. But Nissan had already made the decision that destroyed everything. The arrest just made it official. This is the story of how one decision killed Nissan's greatest comeback. To understand how a rescued company destroys itself, you have to go back to before the rescue. Nissan was in a condition that most companies don't survive, more than $20 billion in debt, 26 straight years of declining market share in its home country. Its banks had stopped lending, Japan needed someone to save its car company, but nobody inside Japan was willing to do what saving it would require. So Renault sent Carlos Ghosn. He was Lebanese-Brazilian, 45 years old, and completely indifferent to how things had always been done. He had spent the previous 3 years earning a nickname that followed him everywhere, Lacoste Killer.
The nickname stuck because he was precise, not ruthless.
He could walk into a company bleeding money and identify within weeks exactly which parts of it were killing the patient. In the spring of 1999, they put him on a plane to Tokyo. To understand what he was walking into, you need to understand what Nissan had once been. Nissan had entered the United States in 1958 under the name Datsun. Small, reliable, affordable. Americans who needed a second car started paying attention. But what turned Nissan into a cultural force was the Datsun 240Z, launched in 1970. This was a sports car that gave you the thrill of a British roadster, without the British roadster's famous habit of leaving you stranded on the side of the road. It became the world's best-selling sports car. By 1979, the successor Z car, the 280ZX, was selling 86,000 units a year in the United States. One every 6 minutes. Nissan had found desirability that Toyota and Honda hadn't. Both built cars that were reliable and well-engineered. But Nissan built cars that were also fun to drive. That combination didn't exist anywhere else. By the mid-1980s, Nissan was selling close to 800,000 cars a year in the United States, a genuine rival to Toyota and Honda. And then the 90s happened. The decline didn't arrive all at once.
Decline never announces itself. You don't notice the rot until it's already structural.
First came the design. The sharp, distinctive cars of the 70s and 80s were replaced by boxy sedans with uninspired interiors, cars that could have been made by anyone. Customers noticed, but Nissan's leadership didn't. And because they didn't notice the design problem, they didn't see the cost problem building behind it. Too many models chasing too few buyers, too many factories running below capacity, too many executives protecting their own divisions instead of the company. But the real damage wasn't the design or the costs, it was what happened when the numbers started coming in bad. While Toyota responded to weakness by asking what they could do better, and Honda doubled down on the engineering discipline that had always defined them, Nissan's leadership looked outward. They blamed currency fluctuations. They blamed regulation. They blamed American consumer preferences and Japanese economic conditions and every external force they could name. They blamed everyone except themselves, which meant the problems never got fixed. They just accumulated. Design decline fed cost bloat. Cost bloat fed market share loss. Market share loss fed more cost bloat. 26 straight years of declining domestic market share, more than $20 billion in debt. Banks had stopped lending. The company whose name meant Japan industry was going to die, and Japan couldn't save it. So Ghosn arrived. He did something that had never been done inside a Japanese corporation at that scale. He visited every single Nissan facility in the world, a design studio in San Diego with 35 people who described themselves as completely disconnected from headquarters. Their projects had been canceled one by one as the company collapsed around them. He sat with them and asked what their vision was and whether anyone had been listening. He abolished the seniority rule, the principle that age determined rank. He created cross-functional teams that mixed senior with junior, Japanese with non-Japanese. But he did the thing that Japanese corporate culture had made impossible for decades. He told the truth, in front of cameras, in front of the national media, and in front of the entire company. Everybody already knew what was wrong. Too many plants, too many suppliers, too many models. But in a Japanese corporation of that size, you simply could not say it out loud. He closed 5 factories. He cut 21,000 jobs. He promised to cut 20% off total expenses. And he said it out loud. The problem with Nissan is not outside the company. The problem is inside. By fiscal year 2000, Nissan had swung from losing billions to an operating profit of $2.3 billion. By 2003, margins hit 11%, among the best in the entire global industry. Ghosn became a celebrity, not a business celebrity, an actual celebrity. Japanese publishers put him in a manga comic book as a corporate superhero. Emperor Akihito awarded him the Blue Ribbon Medal, one of only a handful of non-Japanese recipients since the Meiji era. Nissan was back, and the cars proved it. The Murano in 2002, the 350Z reviving the legendary sports car line, and in 2010, the Nissan Leaf, the first mass-market electric vehicle produced for global sale. But the executives Ghosn had humiliated on the way up were still there, watching, waiting, and the alliance structure he had built contained a flaw that would eventually give them their opening. Renault held 36.8% of Nissan and controlled its strategic direction. In exchange, Nissan received only a 15% non-voting stake in Renault. All the risk of the alliance sat on Nissan's side, none of the control. That imbalance would matter later. By 2011, Nissan was no longer satisfied with survival. The addiction to growth had begun. Ghosn and his team unveiled Nissan Power 88, a plan targeting 8% global market share and 8% operating profit margin by fiscal year 2016. The name referenced the twin 8% goals. Ghosn needed to cement his legacy as one of the greatest executives in automotive history. Growth at any cost served that goal. The executives below him were tired of being controlled by Renault. More scale for Nissan meant more leverage against the French. And the executives who had been watching and waiting since 1999 watched the ambition grow beyond what the company could support. They were patient. They could afford to be. Everyone sitting in Nissan's boardroom had a personal reason to vote yes. Nobody asked the question that mattered. How much will this actually cost us? The executives watching from the boardroom noted every mistake. They were keeping score. If stories like this one interest you, there is a lot more where this came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to Nissan's numbers. To chase the targets, Nissan flooded the market with fleet sales, bulk purchases by rental agencies and corporate fleets. These deals inflated volume but destroyed margin. Nissan was paying nearly double what Honda paid in dealer incentives per vehicle, just to keep the factories busy. By fiscal year 2017, US market share peaked at around 9%. Close to the goal, but profits were collapsing. What looked like success on the sales chart was quietly hollowing out the business underneath. And while the executive team focused on market share percentages, the product suffered. The Altima, once Nissan's best-selling car in America, became something you chose only when you couldn't afford anything better. The SUVs became forgettable. The Leaf, the car that had pioneered the electric vehicle category, was left largely unchanged for years. Battery range stayed limited. The technology stopped advancing. Tesla was a startup when Nissan launched the Leaf in 2010. By 2016, Tesla had taken the electric vehicle category that Nissan had created and turned it into a cultural movement. Nissan handed them the keys. And while the company bled market share on one side, Ghosn was expanding the empire on the other. Power 88 had given them everything they needed. In 2016, Ghosn acquired a 34% stake in struggling automaker Mitsubishi, pulling it into the alliance. 3 car companies were now tied together, all with different problems, all managed by one man increasingly distracted by the demands of running an empire. The targets were missed, the market share was gone, and the man who had made himself irreplaceable had made himself impossible to defend. The executives inside Nissan who had been watching and waiting saw their moment. The Haneda Airport arrest in November 2018 was not a surprise to everyone. Inside Nissan's executive offices in Yokohama, it had been planned. The people who brought financial misconduct allegations to prosecutors were insiders, executives who had worked at Nissan for decades, some of them since before Ghosn arrived. They had watched him become a celebrity while they rebuilt the company from the inside. They had watched him use company properties in multiple countries and corporate aircraft in ways they believed crossed a line. They had watched him push, in his final years, for a structure that would have given Renault even more control over Nissan's future. They had spent nearly 2 decades waiting for a moment when the evidence was strong enough and the internal support was wide enough. By 2018, they had both. The executives inside Nissan's boardroom had decided to stop him, but they had planned for an arrest, not for what came after. Ghosn escaped Japan, not through any legal process, but physically. He was placed inside a large black box used to carry audio equipment, loaded onto a private jet at Kansai Airport in Osaka, flown to Istanbul, transferred to a second private jet, and landed in Beirut, Lebanon, a country with no extradition treaty with Japan. The box was too large to fit through the airport's X-ray scanner. It was never screened. Ghosn maintains his innocence to this day and has filed a lawsuit against Nissan seeking more than $1 billion. Saikawa, Ghosn's replacement as chief executive officer, lasted less than 2 years. An internal investigation found he had been overpaid through improperly adjusted stock compensation, and he was forced to resign. The executives who had removed Ghosn to clean up Nissan had replaced him with someone who needed to be removed for the same reasons. An industry analyst watching the wreckage at Nissan's global headquarters put it simply: Nissan had become ungovernable. You cannot run a car company from a battlefield. In the fiscal year from 2019 to 2020, Nissan posted a net loss of approximately $6.2 billion. It was the company's worst result in decades. Between 2017 and 2022, global sales fell more than 40% and the stock price fell more than 70% from its peak. But the most revealing damage was invisible at first. Car design and development takes between 4 and 7 years from concept to showroom. The dysfunction of 2017 and 2018, the years when Nissan's leadership was consumed by internal warfare and an impending arrest, produced the cars that appeared in dealerships in 2024. Plastic heavy, outdated, not hybrid, not electric. Cars that looked like they had been transported from a 2018 showroom and relabeled as new. The infighting of 2017 was still showing up on the lot 7 years later. That is how long corporate dysfunction echoes in this industry. 30 new models globally by fiscal year 2027. Another outsider was brought in to execute it. Ivan Espinosa, a Mexican executive appointed chief executive officer in April 2025, announced another round of cuts. 20,000 jobs. 17 plants reduced to 10 by 2028, including facilities in Japan that every previous restructuring had specifically avoided. Every large organization moves to protect itself before it moves to improve itself. At Nissan, that reflex had to be broken from the outside, again. So how does a company collapse twice in 25 years? One decision, but it metastasized into 3. The decision was Power 88. It launched in 2011. It targeted 8% market share and an 8% profit margin. The number was chosen because it sounded like ambition. Everything that followed was a consequence of that number. First, the turnaround became an addiction. Ghosn saved Nissan by cutting costs and chasing volume. Then Nissan kept chasing volume long after it stopped working, building cars nobody wanted at prices nobody respected, because stopping would mean admitting the recovery had become the new sickness. Second, they let resentment run the boardroom when they should have been fixing what Power 88 had broken. The executives who survived the Ghosn era spent a decade asking how to undo what he had built. When the opportunity came in November 2018, they took it. They were so focused on removing the man that they forgot to have a plan for what came after. Third, they kept outsourcing their honesty. Ghosn had to come from outside to tell the truth in 1999. It took another outsider to tell it again in 2025. At no point did the institution find the capacity to be honest with itself. The word Nissan comes from Nihon Sangyo, Japan industry. Yoshisuke Aikawa chose that name in the 1930s because he wanted the company to carry something beyond cars. National identity, industrial will, the idea that Japan could build something the world could not ignore. But Japan industry has needed a foreigner to save it every time it nearly died. A Lebanese-Brazilian in 1999, a Mexican in 2025. The name was always the aspiration. The company never quite became it. Nissan has survived twice. The third time, it will have to save itself. If you want to see how a similar story played out at a company that also let growth become an addiction, that video is on screen now.